patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 83 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman. Thank you all so much for joining me this week to discuss our 10th signer of the Declaration of Independence in our Sacred Honor series. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to this podcast, subscribe to our email list if you'd like to get the latest notifications of new episodes and news and updates and all the rest. Also, be sure to look out the Ask Our Guest feature, which hopefully will be out sometime as early as next month. I'll be sure to keep you all posted on that. It's a brand new feature. Hope that it'll be a good opportunity for listeners to be more involved in our guest episodes. So be sure to check out more information in the next few weeks and months. Today, we are going to be talking about Sherman. And no, this is not a third-person autobiography that I intended to insert into this little series here. No, it is about another gentleman named Sherman. It's going to be interesting for me to mention his name over and over again. I don't think I'm going to be able to match this record that I'm about to set by saying his name, his last name, which happens to be my first name. It's going to be interesting. I will be looking a bit into why this founder is especially unique, and not just because of the name, but because of what he did and really the reality of politics that comes out from what Roger Sherman did. Roger Sherman is our first delegate and signer from Connecticut. He was born in Newton, which is in the province of Massachusetts, on April 19th, 1721. And unlike some other signers, he did not have a very elite or extensive education. In fact, he was very much a hands-on person. He started his career as a shoemaker. He later opened up his business right in New Haven. Eventually became someone who was incredibly active in local politics in Connecticut. This allowed him to obviously develop relationships and to be able to understand the issues on the ground. And Connecticut was one of those colonies that was very self-dependent. It didn't really have to depend a lot on needing other colonies to sustain itself. It just had a lot of everything. Roger Sherman was one to get involved in politics in New Milford, Connecticut. He did not get involved a lot in schooling at a young age, but he eventually got along very well with the people out in Yale College, or Yale University as it is known now. He was even elected treasurer of that school and very much loved that institution, set up shop right near the school, so I guess he could kind of track to see what's going on with the school that he was helped funding. But Roger Sherman was one who understood the importance of connecting with the local population, and eventually rose up in the ranks, really, to become a very influential lawmaker representative from Connecticut. Now, as the revolution was kicking off, Sherman was one to, I think, encounter a number of different factions, and the response that he had towards these factions, or at least one of them, is quite indicative of the kind of person that Sherman was. I'll give you an example here. So when he was in Connecticut and we had all these different riots and protests going on, one of these groups, one of the most active groups, was the Sons of Liberty. And they're generally seen as the most radical element, or one of the most radical elements of the American Revolution. And what they did is that they really started doing things that were outlandish, that were seen as just uncivilized and not reflective of the mindset that a number of these people like Roger Sherman had. They started looting, they started harassing officials. Those are the times. So those are difficult times. But Roger Sherman really tried to see both sides, but also acknowledge that we couldn't drift off to a culture of incivility. And here's what he said in response to some of the things that were happening in Connecticut. Connecticut was kind of going out of control. The Sons of Liberty were running around doing whatever it is that they were trying to do, which was, again, ripping things down and burning things and harassing people. It's just madness. Here's what Roger Sherman said, quote, "I have no doubt of the upright intentions of those gentlemen who have promoted the late meetings in several parts of the colony, which I suppose were principally intended to prevent introduction of the stamp papers, and not in the least to oppose the laws or authority of the government. But is there not danger of proceeding too far in such measures?" Unquote. What Sherman is saying is that people have the right to be incensed and furious at what's happening with the Stamp Act and other punitive measures that were coming from Westminster. But is it really justifiable to look like a bunch of headless chickens running around, not knowing what's going on, and not thinking what needs to be done so that a new system can replace the current one and be better than what people have at that time? And Roger Sherman, along with many founders, clearly had extensive careers answering that question of what it was that America was to be in terms of its form of government and the values that the electorate would portray through the system of governance. Roger Sherman continued to work hard and to being one of the most prolific signers of that time. He eventually became a very well-known representative, even earning praise from Thomas Jefferson and from some other founders. Again, not everyone was liking him a lot. Governor Morris from Pennsylvania had quite a few doubts about him and didn't like his ideas very much. And, well, naturally, Roger Sherman was like, well, if he doesn't like my ideas very much, I'm probably not going to like a lot of his ideas. And, well, anyway, that's a whole other story with Governor Morris. But Sherman was so influential that he was eventually chosen to be one of the members of a group called the Committee of Five, which was a group of delegates who would come up with the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to backtrack a little bit here because there was one other document I'd like to mention, which is called the Articles of Association, which is also known as the Continental Association. And this was essentially a declaration that the colonies would not trade with Great Britain unless they start getting rid of these laws, like the Intolerable Acts and all the other punitive measures that were imposed on the colonies. Sherman was not only known as someone who was able to speak, who knew how to write despite his limited education, he was also, I think, known because he showed up. And while that sounds very simple, and I'm not saying that anyone who didn't show up is all of a sudden an outcast or someone who isn't anywhere near the kind of intellect he had, but the fact that he was able to be there when they signed the Continental Association, the fact that he was able to be there debating with other members in the Committee of Five and ultimately the entire Second Continental Congress to debate on the Declaration of Independence and become the 10th signer of that document, as well as being involved in some other document signings, including the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution, meant that not only was he someone who showed up a lot and who clearly got involved and got very, very passionate about politics and about figuring out new ways to govern, but he is the only person who signed all four of the great papers in American history: the Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. He also even signed a petition to the king, which was back in 1774, I believe. That didn't work out very well. But again, the theme is that Sherman was known as someone who said, okay, if he is so passionate about his cause for liberty and for a free people, we know that he will be there. And we know that he's going to be there, and he's not just going to sit around, drinking coffee or sitting around eating donuts or something. He's going to be standing up and being active and being passionate, and maybe someone who might not have a whole lot of character, as Roger Sherman was constantly viewed as, but he was one who often think before he spoke, and to think whether he was sitting at his desk or chatting with some fellow representatives, he was always thinking, okay, what is that next new idea? What was it that he could use to negotiate and to work with others? And that really is going to be a bigger theme as we go along in this episode when we speak about some of the things that he was able to accomplish. One big thing that emerged out of this was after the signing of the Declaration, and this was in the midst of the conflict, was that Sherman was not, that Washington, number one sort of person. That was not his first choice. But he believed that in this time of crisis, we needed to find someone who at least had some qualities. Even if it wasn't the perfect person that he had in mind, he wanted to find someone and choose someone, but wanted to help so that the voice is unanimous in electing or choosing a leader. And so he cast his vote for George Washington as the commander-in-chief, even though Washington was not his number one choice. We certainly don't see that a lot. I feel like a lot of times nowadays in society, it's always the my way or the highway sort of culture, where if people don't get their way, then they start acting up, they start making character assassinations or whatever it is that people are doing. It's really unfortunate, but it gives a bit more confidence and faith in the system when one sees the behavior of Roger Sherman and the way that he was able to conduct himself. Again, not the most charismatic person, and certainly charisma is a big deal. There's certainly other signers who compensated for that, who were clearly a lot more boisterous than Roger Sherman. But the behavior that Mr. Sherman put out as a delegate, as a debater, is certainly reflective in what I'm about to discuss, which is about the U.S. Constitution. Now, to give some background here, what was happening was that the economy was just terrible. I mean, it's certainly the most simplistic statement you can ever make about an economy, and it's probably very, very relevant to what's happening nowadays with inflation and all those measures. But Roger Sherman was in the midst of a very difficult time for the country, where we had the Articles of Confederation, and one that he supported. He signed the Articles of Confederation, and his idea was that it was kind of an enforcement problem. It wasn't really like a structural problem where he felt that, the states are too strong or too weak, or the militias need to be stronger or weaker. It wasn't really about that, or it wasn't really about the state governments itself. He felt that the states were just not being enforced. They felt that these other states were not cooperating, or that there's some kind of way where we can work together, and so that you can have some kind of cohesive nature across 13 colonies. Well, that clearly wasn't the case. He realized that not only were the economic conditions terrible, but that the integrity and the cohesiveness of this new country was in jeopardy. One such event was Shays' Rebellion. Shays was a farmer who served in the Revolutionary War, and he felt that the U.S. government, or really the states, under the Articles of Confederation, were not compensating people. He argued that there were a number of people who served for the nation and were falling into debt, who couldn't afford anything, who were struggling with poverty, with starvation. and he helped lead a rebellion against the new government. And what came about was that Sherman and the other founders realized that it was not an enforcement issue. The reality is that we just simply did not have a strong enough central government to keep things together. One state is arguing this, another state's arguing this. Well, who's right? Then you've got this internal dispute problem. Sherman set out, along with the other founders, to think about a new system of government. And this debate was clearly very, very contentious, as you can probably imagine. Think about the Jeffersonians and the Anti-Federalists who wanted the states to have more power. And then you've got the Federalists, like those with Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, John Jay, to be the ones to defend the Constitution, or the idea of the Constitution, and to say we need a stronger central federal government. One major sticking point was on the structure of the federal legislature. You had large states who were saying, no, you've got to have a system of government where it is based on population. We larger states, essentially, need to be kind of rewarded for having all this people, because we need to support the state services. We have a lot of people of different issues. And so we need to really build a system that reflects a state's votes based on population. The smaller states argued, oh, no. What about us? What about the small states that can't afford larger populations? Why should we have a lesser say? If we're all in the same country, if we're all saying that we have a free people, but we're letting the majority dictate all the rules and make all the decisions, then what's the point of having a small state? And this debate just went on and on and on. In comes Roger Sherman, telling both sides. One side, the large states, having the Virginia plan, which reflected their attitudes towards how a federal legislature could work, and then the smaller states had something like the New Jersey plan. And he proposed that we have a lower house where the votes are determined per state based on population, and we have the upper house where every single state gets one vote. And also that because the House, or the lower chamber, is going to react a bit more closely with the majority, or with what the popular sentiment is, that the appropriations and the funding bills will originate from the lower house. And after much discussion and lobbying and debates and arguments, thank goodness probably not a lot of fistfights, there was finally a vote to adopt this new model. Initially, it did not work, though. Initially, the motion failed 6-5, and then eventually was tied, and there was just so much contention. But finally, there was the ability to recognize we didn't get everything. Not everyone got everything they wanted. And maybe some people still had their arguments that this compromise wasn't ideal. But there needed to be change. There needed to be a more positive change that could reflect better on the will of the people in every single state. And thus, the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise of 1787, was born, created, ratified, adopted, and now part of our Constitution. Sherman was also very active in realizing that slavery is a moral value, but an issue that could be compromised. This one is very tricky because I want to make clear that Sherman himself and some others, including Elbridge Gerry, were vehemently opposed to slavery. They believed that as part of their own religious values and moral values, that slavery was wrong. Sherman believed that eventually slavery would be abolished, that it was going that direction. But he knew that he needed to have allies. And that's why he worked with members from South Carolina, from Georgia, from all of these southern states, to be able to work out deals where he knew that if they could agree on certain measures that could protect their economies, that could ensure some kind of economic growth, that he would be able to advance bigger parts of legislation. That's one of the reasons why Sherman was so influential, is because he recognized that he was not going to be able to change every single person's viewpoint, but he needed to use the tools that he had. Slavery, which, given the times, was still very widely accepted, but he was still able to, at the very minimum, limit the ability for slavery to be so widespread, institutionally and across the country. Sherman also had a bit of an interesting background as well, as someone who was very much devoted to law. And he had written a piece in the 1750s that I think is also very relevant and something that may have contributed to the work that he did as a member within the Second Continental Congress. He certainly did a lot of work there, working on government matters, working hard just like almost everybody else. But he wrote this document called A Caveat Against Injustice. And just a summary of this document here, he was arguing that paper money was a bad way to settle relationships between debtors and creditors. And he says that there is essentially a moral hazard where debtors use paper money to depreciate the value. And guess who suffers? He quotes the widows and orphans, which he really is referencing the average folk. He says that these people are the ones who are going to suffer the most, that they are expected to maintain a respectable standard of living based on fixed income. With that money depreciating, he thinks that it is not only bad for their income and for their well-being, but that it went against the laws of man and God. If this isn't relevant to today, I don't know what is. I'm not saying that we should abolish paper money. That's not my position now. But Roger Sherman makes a really good point about the importance of at least understanding why the Federal Reserve nowadays is an incredibly important institution, and maybe why we should reconsider the fact that an agency can be independent. I'm not going to go specifics into specific legislation at this time, but when we've got one institution that is considered independent, anything in Washington is not independent. Clearly, this is very much jargon in politics, but it really makes us think about: is it worth spending $6 trillion on COVID relief? Understanding that there were different conditions, that the times were changing rapidly, but now it requires some kind of contemplation on the importance of fiscal responsibility, of understanding that inflation is essentially it's almost like a tax. It was at that time in the 1780s when they were dealing with inflation, the sentiments, while the times were very, very different at the time, the pinch that people feel in their wallets was exactly the same feeling that these people, the widows and orphans that he cited in this piece, were the ones suffering the most, getting the same income, but because of the depreciation, can't afford the same kind of goods and services anymore. Now, on a final note, Roger Sherman eventually continued to be very active in politics. He was mayor of New Haven for a long time. Again, he was involved in state government, local government. He also took a big financial hit and also a hit to his health. Over the years, in the 1790s, his health got worse and worse. On July 23rd, 1793, Roger Sherman passed away at the age of 72 in New Haven, Connecticut. Roger Sherman was one of the most influential signers because he was willing to compromise on the important issues, but he never said goodbye to his values. As a Puritan, as someone who strongly opposed slavery, as someone who believed in the state to have more powers, even taking powers away from direct election from the popular vote, he was very, very adamant on his values of what he thought would be best for government and for holding accountability across all government officials. And while there's so many things that one can draw from Roger Sherman, I'd like to bring up three main takeaways that I think are very, very important from him. The first, if we want to make change, we got to show up and be active. And while it sounds so obvious, I just can't tell you how many times there are people who say they want to do something. They say they support such and such, but they don't really act on it. They just like saying it, or they like to be with people who are doing things. And while it's important to build movements and to have coalitions, my thinking is that we just need to be more honest with what our intentions are and the kinds of involvement that we want to be in. If someone wants to go out and just say, I just want to march, or I just want to sign this petition, just recognize that this is how I view my participation. Then at least we can have more honest debates about agents of change, about the amount of change that people are willing to accept or to push for. But by trying to cloud people's civic participation into some kind of like revolution, as if every single day there's some kind of revolution for such and such, I'm sorry, but that's quite overblown. We have to recognize that change is incremental and that it's not easy, but it can be done. And one needs to build those relationships with others. One needs to be more active in communities. I'm certainly one to say that even myself, I want to find new ways to be able to connect with other people, to connect with local government, with other constituents and other fellow voters too. And this kind of leads me to the second takeaway, which is I hope that we will embrace compromise as a natural and necessary vehicle for change. Compromise within the word itself, what's so unique is that there's the word promise in it. Not guarantee, not definitely it's going to happen. It also doesn't say definitely not going to happen, but it says promise. There's the word promise in compromise. There is promise in compromise. What we compromise on clearly is one of very little debate, actually, when you think about it. Like there's no compromise on whether murder is right or wrong. I mean, come on, that's it's too easy, right? But compromise is more of a recognition that change is incremental, and that while there are fluctuations of revolutions, of high points of change, but the gradual acceptance across different generations, across different people is gradual. And it's not an easy fight. It's not easy to implement these changes, but to recognize that compromise is a way for people to come together and say, okay, we've got something, they've got something, that person has something. Not everyone's going to be equally happy or equally furious, but we know that we have advanced something, we are going in this right direction. That, I think, is where compromise really sets in. And compromise has to occur on the issues. This leads me to the final takeaway, which is you can compromise on issues, but you can never compromise on your values. One's values of integrity, of honesty, of love for one's country, those can never go away. Only oneself can keep those values. But you can compromise on issues. Like Roger Sherman, he believed that if people could not move past the issue of slavery, even though he wanted slavery to be gone, even though his values were never going to change, he knew that he could not change people's opinions right away, that he felt we needed to move towards that direction. I think it's the same thing nowadays. If we want to have some kind of advancement, say, on public health, there's been a lot of talk in COVID. Let's not revert back to those reactive measures that we took in March 2020. Let's think about what sort of things do we want to see from different sides. Let's find new ways to come up with packages of legislation or policies that could reflect an ability for people to act as they please as long as they act within the law, but ways that the government is also there as a safety net. There's just so many instances where we have drifted a lot away from compromise. Like I said earlier, there's so many people who feel like they need to be the one, my way or the highway. What I can tell those people, based on what I've seen and what a lot of people have done in their careers, so that is not the case in Washington, D.C. No, nothing ever gets done when a bunch of people, my way or the highway folks, come in and say, all right, this is the way to go. That's not what happens. It's not what happens in D.C. or Albany or Carson City or Sacramento, wherever it is. There needs to be some kind of recognition that compromise, while imperfect, is a necessary tool that we can use to advance our country. Once again, Roger Sherman, one of my most admirable founding fathers. When I was giving tours of the Capitol as working as an intern in Congress back in summer of 2019, there would be this hallway between the Senate vestibule where the old Senate chamber used to be. This is on the lower floor. And when I guided people down that hallway into the crypt, which is down just below the Capitol Rotunda, I loved how they perfectly fit that sculpture of Roger Sherman. Of course, the bottom of the sculpture says Sherman. And I always joke with people and say, hey, I want to show you a statue of me. And of course, they would laugh and they would say, oh, no, it's not about him. It's about Roger Sherman, clearly the gentleman from Connecticut, even though the member I was working for was not from Connecticut. But it was just a nice way to strike up the conversation a little bit about Roger Sherman. And he was certainly an unexpected addition to the Capitol tours I used to give. So Roger Sherman, very interesting character, one who I think is very much underrated and underappreciated. But I hope that you enjoyed this episode about our 10th signer of the Declaration of Independence, the first signer from the state of Connecticut. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure, once again, to subscribe to Friends of Fellow Citizens to get more content every week. Have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. And remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.